I have to cover this, don't I? Fuck it, I've wanted to do a video on cyberpunk as a genre since I started this channel. I'm just going to use Cyberpunk 2077 to talk about that. So first, what is cyberpunk? A lot of people make the mistake of assuming cyberpunk refers to something as well defined as, say, the first-person shooter. First-person shooters are almost always an unambiguous case. You're doing a shoot and the camera is in the first-person perspective. Cyberpunk, while our popular imagination conjures up images of robotic arms, grizzled mercs, and surprisingly often Keanu Reeves, it's a far more nebulous genre than that, born of a reaction to neoliberalism's encroachment during the 70s and 80s, and a sense of fear over the changing world. Not that change was bad per se, but that would be misused. What ties and defines cyberpunk together is a broad and very nebulous definition. High-tech, low-life. A focus on the strange, wonderful, liberatory, oppressive new technologies and those who aren't on the top of the social ladder, and how those two mix. It is often, but far from always, about 20 minutes into the future. That is, a world that's essentially our modern day with fancier technology. This means that most anything can fall under the label of cyberpunk if it concerns itself with those ideas, and the different subgenres of cyberpunk, such as nowpunk, which focuses on the modern day, will emphasize or de-emphasize one part of the formula. The different types of cyberpunk are also extremely nebulous when it comes to different genres entirely. One of my favorite examples of this is Alien. While it's unambiguously a horror movie, it's often also considered a precursor to cyberpunk while lacking many traditional cyberpunk features. This means that cyberpunk is notoriously hard to define and doesn't really adhere to a lot of norms in its themes or ideas. This also means that cyberpunk politics can be a bit scattered, and while there's the perception that cyberpunk should openly challenge and question the status quo of capitalism, that's not exactly the case. Antipathy towards the corporate order and towards capitalism is very common within cyberpunk, but it is hardly like a Marxist genre or something. Cyberpunk's origins are extremely murky, as it's not a movement that was just announced one day and instantly accepted. In fact, the term cyberpunk was first used as a title of the short story by Bruce Bethke in 1983. After Alien, Judge Dredd, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and other proto-cyberpunk stories, and after the quintessential cyberpunk movie, Blade Runner. Neuromancer by William Gibson is often credited with the popularization of cyberpunk. It carries a lot of the tropes you might imagine: a cool anti-hero hacker who lost his connection to the net due to neurological damage. He's a man defined by coolness, bitter anger, the type of person who could wear a trench coat in the summer and not be mocked as a mall ninja. Just listen to this description of Case and try to tell me you can't almost perfectly imagine the archetype.
He'd been trained by the best, by McCoy Pauly and Bobby Quine, legends in the biz. He'd operated on an almost permanent adrenaline high, a byproduct of youth and proficiency, jacked into a custom cyberspace deck that projected his disembodied consciousness into the consensual hallucination that was the Matrix. A thief, he'd worked for other wealthier thieves, employers who provided the exotic software required to penetrate the bright walls of corporate systems, opening windows into rich fields of data. He'd made the classic mistake, the one he'd sworn he'd never make. He stole from his employers.
The umbrella term cyberpunk caught on, and its genre's tropes became codified, stereotyped, and stagnated in a specific way. It's why we recognize this as cyberpunk or this as cyberpunk despite not really having all that much to do outside of aesthetics, and that's it. Over time, a lot of people involved in the origin of cyberpunk began to resent it, and this came to a head with a story by Bethke himself titled Headcrash, and the attitude he had towards it is summed up pretty nicely by this quote.
That place is full of young guys with no social lives, no sex lives, and no hope of ever moving out of their mother's basements. They're total wankers and losers who indulge in messianic fantasies about someday getting even with the world through almost magical computer skills, but whose actual use of the net amounts to dialing up the scatophilia form and downloading a few disgusting pictures. You know, cyberpunks.
This shift in attitude from, let's call them the old guard, has led to the common declaration that cyberpunk is dead. In fact, declaring the death of cyberpunk has become a cliché so common that most everyone who had a hand in its creation distanced itself from it, terrified to become commodified and died. And that's a fair, valid concern. I'm not going to deny that in this video. However, I think that the hasty attempt to claim that cyberpunk is dead is at best limited. I actually think it's a little absurd. Imagine if someone went around shouting, "Space opera is dead," just because the Star Wars sequels felt tired or overdone. If something feels tired, overdone, or cliché, that's because it needs to innovate. I've even seen the take that cyberpunk cannot be meaningfully made anymore because we all live in a cyberpunk dystopia. And to be blunt, that requires a willful ignorance of cyberpunk's origins and aesthetics. Gibson's Bridge trilogy heavily features depictions of the Kowloon Walled City, a real place that was actually demolished only in 1993. RoboCop is a scathing critique of the militarization of the police and the war on drugs that was occurring as the film was made. And more recent works, such as Elysium, pull heavily from plans that we see from actual rich people today to just go to space. Cyberpunk has always pulled from the real world, always shown with sharp relief the horrors of corporate control, of people being used like resources. Not a single one of its ideas was come up with a priori. If Cyberpunk was alive before and died when we started living in a cyberpunk dystopia, the only recognizable difference seems to be it used to happen in places well-off Americans could ignore. Indie developers are working to make interesting, compelling cyberpunk all the time, and yet you hear that cyberpunk is supposed to be dead. Its era is over. Cyberpunk is dead. Cyberpunk remains dead, and we have killed it. How shall we comfort ourselves, O murderers of all murderers? It would of course be remiss of me to mention that I've thus far only focused on, and will largely focus on, Western cyberpunk. I'm talking about a game that's in that tradition. Asian cyberpunk is a whole different strand of cyberpunk that emerged from similar but still extremely distinct material conditions and circumstances, and there was sort of a feedback loop between the two. I feel like I have to give Asian cyberpunk its due. Cyberpunk as we know it would not exist without Ghost in the Shell, without Akira, or countless other influences. Anyways, I think that a much more constructive view of cyberpunk's role comes from the book The Souls of Cyberfolk by Thomas Foster.
In an age when the World Transhumanist Organization holds meetings to debate the ethics of technologically mediated forms of embodiment and subjectivity, when Edward O. Wilson laments that we are on the verge of decommissioning natural selection and thus losing our physical soul, the evolutionary legacy of our species' unity, and Francis Fukuyama warns that biotechnology threatens us with a post-human future that can only be warded off if we establish state control over our human essence, cyberpunk, as an attempt to intervene in and contest this historical debate, to find alternatives to its limitations and imaginative failures, matters now more than ever.
Cyberpunk has relevance because it asks questions about the future, about humanity, who we are and what we're doing with technology, capitalism, our notions of humanity. It doesn't die because Bethke says so, because genres don't live or die by the whims of individuals. And even then, I don't think Cyberpunk ever died. Gone into hibernation? Sure. Maybe it took a nap in a chrysalis and transformed during the years of Bush and jingoism and ooh-rah Americanism, but not died. There is a clear and present interest in its ideas and themes. After all, each day we wake up in a world increasingly ruled by corporations full of technocratic solutions orientated around profit. Corporate interests, to be blunt, have massively benefited from one of the greatest tragedies of the 21st century. With millions dead around the globe, partially from a pseudo-death cult that is modern capitalism, and partially due to a media apparatus designed to sell ideas that make the pandemic even more dangerous, corporations have raked in billions of dollars while laying off hundreds of thousands. Human suffering was easily, effectively converted into stocks and checks. Bezos et al. Are the villains of our cyberpunk story. And so long as the ruling class of society values technocratic capitalism over human dignity, cyberpunk won't die. If it shambles on still, it's because our society has a place for it still. And so, since I feel we need to get to the actual point now, Cyberpunk 2077. Is it Cyberpunk? I've seen the suggestion it should be called something else because of how a lot of people perceive Cyberpunk as being some innately revolutionary, anti-capitalist bonanza, but we had it good with The Matrix. But Cyberpunk isn't about revolutions, it's about reckoning with technology and our humanity in relation to it. So while I will talk about how the game handles its very obvious thematic text of corporate dystopia, I'm quite concerned with how it handles technology in general as well. And so with that important context out of the way, it's time to talk about Cyberpunk 2077. Here is my official, objective, unambiguous review of Cyberpunk 2077. It's fine. I mean, it's not like I'm going to try to 100% it or anything, but it's fine. It doesn't have nearly the bite to it I wanted. Keanu Reeves is fine in it. It has some pretty good gunplay. I mean, I'm a bad judge of that anyways. But what do you want me to say? If you came here for fawning praise, you probably left when I started this video off by not praising CDPR and defending them. If you came here for a hateful rant, we don't do that here. But as for the actual content and story of the game, that's something I want to dig into. In my rant video when this game first came out, I hinted at this, but I should probably go into it. The game repeatedly emphasizes that despite the seemingly futuristic nature of the entire setting, not much has really changed in the 50 years between the tabletop RPG and the video game's settings. Soulkiller is half a century old, cybernetics dexterous enough to play guitars are at least as old, most characters are also related to the story that are at least 50 years old. In the flashbacks to the 2020s, the tech looks very similar. In addition, the main method to sharing data is to use what amounts to a futuristic USB chip directly inserted into one's head, a concept not wholly unfamiliar to Cyberpunk, but it still feels like something someone from the 80s came up with, like how they used to think our AI would be 20 petaflops or something. So overall, for a game that's supposedly a 50-year evolution of a setting, it doesn't feel that way. When given the chance to, in a setting and genre about change, evolution, and adaptation, change, evolve, and adapt, the game didn't do all that much. This has led to, I think, the description as dad rock. The image fits it well, I think, a dad trying to get their kid into music by playing the old stuff they rocked out to, unaware there's been 50 years of evolution since. There's also a lot of references to old songs as well, although they rarely mean anything in the context of the wider story, and only seem to be a reference so that we know that they know of a song from the 80s. Riders on the Storm, Dream On, Don't Fear the Reaper, These Boots Are Made for Walking, and others are name-dropped seemingly without purpose. A lot of Cyberpunk 2077's storytelling is based around trying to shock and disgust you. There are legitimately touching and beautiful moments in the game, but I can never escape the feeling that this game found out that genitals, blood, and swear words exist and can't wait to show all of them off. Sometimes this can be done well. In particular, I think showing off the sheer savagery of the black market prosthetics business where people are abducted and torn apart is, at least in my reading, a good metaphor for how capitalism in general promotes a dog-eat-dog mentality. But I know that's my reading, and I don't even know if they intended that. There is stuff that's thrown in that just feels try-hard. It'll show you, for example, a legitimately decent piece of transgender representation. Then they'll slap you with this Rocky Horror Picture Show Buffalo Bill nonsense and ask you, don't you want to punch him? Aren't we edgy yet? It'll make you purchase and play and replay a snuff scene over and over again to discover every tiny detail, and you can practically feel them nudging you saying, isn't this edgy? This is a game without restraint, and not in a way that's fun. They hammer you over the head with the idea that this city and its people are almost inherently cruel to the point of utter inhumanity. Between the constant advertisements that seem to have a high schooler sense of humor and constant reminders of how shitty the city is, with criminals who are evil for the sake of being evil, one side mission involves a group of people abducting monks to forcibly modify them with expensive augments for kicks. And then when you combine that with the civilians who yell at you constantly before despawning, the game just feels needlessly cruel and draining. It doesn't feel fun to be a criminal in Night City. There are parts of the game I unambiguously love. Judy's story is a standout piece of writing, and I felt for her and her plight, and helping the Moxes liberate the dollhouse so the Moxes could step in and protect the sex workers who were being abused. That's all class. I love it. These are all also missions that are filled with brutality, agony, death, and pain, with betrayals and reprisals that essentially make your work for naught. So it feels like they wanted to sweep what you actually did under the rug, so that you could just fuck Judy. So unfortunately, while there's a lot of cool stuff, it also ends up feeling a little overly dark, grim, and cruel. And I love dark, grim, cruel worlds. See my Warhammer 40k or TNO video. But it needs to be balanced in some way, with intentions and ideas that don't just amount to a convenient reason for you to use mantis blades. And then we start getting into the actual antagonists, and it just starts to feel worse. Arasaka is a really generic antagonist, a scary threat so pure evil that a nuclear bomb going off in their headquarters and killing tens of thousands is, while not framed as good, framed as understandable and a little badass. I think to understand one of the core problems with Arasaka, you need to understand its ace in the hole: Soulkiller. Soulkiller is a program that runs on Arasaka computers that can create a copy of someone's mind once they've been connected to a neural network, netrunning as the game calls it. It then kills the netrunner and saves their mind as data on the engram, which is a device that can be used in relics to resurrect people. This allows Arasaka to basically murder anyone across the world who dares use an incredibly common technology, and in essence steal their soul. This is an absurd, almost fantastical level of technology that can only be in the cyberpunk world. And that's fine, but I kind of want to dig into it to see how it's used narratively, because while the game doesn't broach this topic, I will. If Soulkiller wasn't a factor, Arasaka would be something worth attacking and dismantling. Soulkiller is irrelevant in the equation of should a company that practically owns its own fiefdom be attacked and dismantled, and you're shown constant examples of Arasaka's non-Soulkiller cruelty. This feels almost like a way to broaden the appeal of destroying Arasaka. I don't think anyone, even on the furthest corner of the libertarian right, would oppose destroying Soulkiller, a violation of the McNuke Clause or something. It helps turn Arasaka into a generic, evil antagonist with no redeeming qualities or defensibility, and safely relegates moral questions that it and other companies, and in fact the whole system of capitalism within the worlds of the game, behind what amounts to an ancient fantasy evil. There's also an uncomfortable strain of Orientalism in how Arasaka is depicted. This is going to take a little bit of history, so bear with me. During the early days of cyberpunk, the genre, there was a cultural fear in Americans born out of the Japanese economic miracle that led to the perception Japan was a place of ultra-technology, yakuza, and zaibatsus, all run by efficient and muted company men. It was painted as a place of unreasonable, almost magical technology, full of people just waiting to screw you over. The characters we meet from Arasaka are in this vein: cold, calculating, and distant, with one notable exception that is only revealed when you side with Arasaka, far too late for it to have an impact on the moral complexities of the story. It's an 11th hour reveal only some players will see. That's sort of an issue with multiple endings. CDPR copied and pulled from old sources, and while its own TTRPG forebearer, in turn, pulled from a lot of contemporary sources in the same light, It didn't examine it when given the chance to update. That's all I'm saying CDPR did. It's a revival of old tropes based on overblown fears of a Japanese takeover and America's decline. This leads to Arasaka feeling not just like a generic antagonist, but one that plays into a lot of tropes that were best left in the 80s, no matter what the intentions of CDP are. This, plus the way the Tiger Claws are treated as disposable mooks and extremely cruel. The sex workers you try to liberate in Judy's stories are abused by Tiger Claws who have no characters to round them out or make them feel like full people, they're just generically bad. And it all mixes to give me a weird feeling. This isn't, of course, to say that Japan or Asia is off limits for cyberpunk. There's just a specific history with the type of depictions we see in Cyberpunk 2077, where Japanese people are linked to criminal syndicates, megacorporations, and encroachment on American life and freedom, and little else. Links to the articles discussing this, along with a lot of articles I drew from in writing this video, will be down in the description, as this is a complex topic in the first place. Of course, Militech, Biotechnica, and others aren't totally ignored, but they remain largely unexamined relative to Arasaka and make up small sections of the main plot. There's a lot of reasons for this, and a big one is probably the unspoken idea that Arasaka is inherently more cruel and evil because of Soulkiller. Who cares what Biotechnica is up to, or that private militaries exist when people can be murdered at will and turned into Arasaka property, and have been for 50-odd years? Everything becomes side content compared to Soulkiller and its consequences. Speaking of Arasaka's property, Johnny, the true protagonist of the game. Johnny Silverhand is a confused mess of anti-capitalist sentiment, punk rock, and denial of said anti-capitalist sentiment. And right when you think the game is broaching some interesting ideas about capitalism and corporations in the universe, he drops this line.
V, I've declared war not because capitalism's a thorn in my side or out of nostalgia for an America gone by. This war's a people's war against a system that spiraled out of our control. It's a war against the fucking forces of entropy. Understand?
And there's a lot of ways to interpret that, but I interpret this and his whole story as just another look at how edgy we are story. A man who rants about corporate colonization, fought in corporate wars, and uses a corporate nuclear bomb to annihilate a corporate tower, and apparently he has not made the connection between corporations and the economic system they're in. He's either incredibly ignorant or intentionally written to appeal to a limp bad boy aesthetic that doesn't call out the power structures or systems of government. It's sort of a Sex Pistols style anarchy. His rage towards Arasaka is entirely justified given what happens to him, but his motivation is limp-wristed. And no matter how often Johnny rants about corporate cruelty, the fact remains that none of it compares to V's desire to live. The sole and only motivation V has throughout the game is the desire to live, and they can choose to sacrifice themselves in the end, but ultimately everything in the story is done towards that end goal of getting Johnny out, until it's revealed again at the 11th hour that there's no way V will live either way. So a tension arises where you feel as though Johnny's rantings and ravings are meant to be the drive of the game, but don't really matter to the story. It feels like listening to your college roommate who has a Che Guevara shirt and thinks anarchism means nihilistic violence, rant while you're just trying to take your fucking meds. And of course, Cyberpunk need not be this communistic vision where the pages bleed red. While antipathy towards the world and corporations is more or less standard, it's not like to be Cyberpunk you need to quote Marx. However, when you bring up capitalism and corporate control as potential motivations, just to repudiate them, you're opening yourself up to criticism. If this was a more standard revenge story where they just never touched that topic, I would not be complaining any more than I'd complain about why Lord of the Rings doesn't accurately depict the agricultural norms of Anglo-Saxon England. They bring it up only to repudiate it. There's a point in the game, though, that I found interesting. When you're talking to the Arasaka goon who helps you out of loyalty to the old CEO, He outright challenges you, telling you corporations are good because they helped him and no one else is offering a better solution. Critique all you want, but what's the other option? On one hand, that's cool. The hopelessness of the setting is interesting. However, given the rest of the game is a looter shooter where you spend all your time doing cool action movie moves, sneaking around corporate buildings, gunning down corporate soldiers, and so on, the feeling isn't carried on the way it should be. Instead of a reflection of how brutal and cruel and how completely hopeless Night City is, it ends up being a scene that points out the obvious, does very little with it, and then you carry on being a badass who has no ideology or purpose outside killing, the nebulous goal of being the top, and getting a robot out of your head. It tries to be intelligent, and fumbles hard. And between the delirious highs of loot and the crushing lows of bugs, what ends up coming through to me is the sheer tension the game finds itself in. It both wants to be a cyberpunk story full of verisimilitude and gritty realism, while focusing on some cartoonishly evil antagonist. It wants to develop characters who have interesting, legitimately fun stories, while also centering the entire plot around a single dynamic that exclude all others if you don't want to do the side content. It wants to be a bold, new direction forwards for the setting, while barely changing it and resurrecting old characters for advertising credit. It advertises itself as gritty and edgy, and it comes across as farcical. It serves as entertaining good escapism. It's not the worst game in the world, and I'll admit I wasn't coming into this being neutral. But at the end of the day, it does feel messy, in tension, uncertain of itself. And I think, is this what Cyberpunk will become? Is this really where the genre is headed? I don't think so. I think those who declare the death of Cyberpunk might be right about one thing. Cyberpunk has been commodified and is now part of the cultural corporate zeitgeist, but to abandon it in my mind isn't the way forwards. To do that would be to cede territory where it's not needed, to misunderstand fundamentally that genre isn't static, that it can instead evolve, change, and carry forwards. It matters now more than ever to explore worlds where technology, capitalism, humanity, identity all intersect, change, and shift, and Cyberpunk has been the space for that. And it's been that space since the 80s. But why are we still basing it on the 80s? One of the reasons why Cyberpunk is dead is so commonly said is because of the recuperative condition of Cyberpunk, how corporations are able to use it now. Cyberpunk became mainstream and, in a manner of speaking, died because massive corporations were able to use it. We see this most clearly with Cyberpunk 2077, where reports have come out about how workers were treated, the hundreds of hours of crunch, the delays that did nothing, blaming the QA team for not catching problems, and the other such claims that stretch the suspension of disbelief so far it practically snaps. And this gets to the core of what's wrong with Cyberpunk 2077. I don't think you can meaningfully make a movie, television show, or book about the horrific and direct encroachment of capitalism into our daily lives while being part of that horrific encroachment yourself. I'm not going to assign a dollar value that says no more social commentary allowed, nor am I going to say that revolutionary narratives are impossible. It's simply going to be, more often than not, happening within a heavily fictionalized narrative that doesn't reflect on the real world. This is why I think CDPR as a corporation so evil it steals souls, as opposed to something more realistic yet deeply awful. A massive company that merely abused its workers might hit closer to home. I'm not trying to make an appeal to Cyberpunk having once had a radical, dangerous past that threatened the status quo. The unfortunate truth is that outside of independent publishers and media, there's very little that isn't from the outset commodified and, in many ways, defanged. While Cyberpunk's antipathy to the corporate world and encroachment of capitalist technology is clear and obvious, It's a stretch to say that many works provided a rigorous, systemic critique of the world, or were perceived as legitimately threatening to the status quo. And that's fine. Fiction isn't what's going to change the world. But what a work does need to have is a clear vision of what it is. I don't think Cyberpunk 2077 has that clear vision. However, I don't think this is reason enough to throw the entire genre out. To do so would be to throw the cyber baby out the cleaning nanites or whatever. I'm not good with metaphors. If anything, I think this game is an incredible reminder as to what the power of Cyberpunk actually is. And for those of us who love Cyberpunk, it's an opportunity to promote that which we love, the genre we care about, the new stuff, the good old stuff, exposed to new eyes. Being mainstream does not kill something. That's the fucking music was better back in my day attitude of dad rockers whose favorite bands stopped existing before their children were born. That's stagnation, a willing refusal to move forwards. And in a genre like Cyberpunk, that is death, but it doesn't need to be. There's been articles about Cyberpunk lately. I'm a fan of this one by Games Radar that posits that audiences don't care about Cyberpunk. The reason I like it is because I think it's pretty on the money about what's happening. Cyberpunk is changing, evolving, shifting. A lot of the articles declaring the death of Cyberpunk insist that the same general themes can be carried forwards, but that we need something new. Something that isn't Cyberpunk. A distinction, I think, without a difference. Genres that evolve and change don't die, they just change. We don't need to be contented with Cyberpunk 2077 as the representation of Cyberpunk, and I think we need to understand that in many ways, it isn't. See, Cyberpunk 2077 is based on the TTRPG by Mike Pondsmith. It's almost 35 years old at this point. It's a depiction of the future from the 80s, over 3 decades later and still being used. And it's being used by corporations to produce something that feels as stale as, well, a 30-year-old depiction of the future. This is from the era when Cyberpunk was nascent, new, and unformed, when the internet was barely a thing, when people thought we would be nerve splicing and hacking through thoughts, when mobile phones didn't exist and computer technology was measured in kilobytes and megabytes, not terabytes. All of this stuff is outdated, and we should update our ideas about the future, lest we resign ourselves to hauntological onanism. The problem with Cyberpunk 2077 isn't that it's Cyberpunk, nor is the problem with Cyberpunk that it's irrelevant. It's that 2077 sticks to visions so old they're quaint. It doesn't modify, change, or update. It stays safe and completely uncritical of our world by being critical of a world that once could have been but never will be our future. High-budget ventures often feel comparatively stale or rote or by the numbers because they don't want to experiment, they don't want to move outside a formula. It's too risky to do that, and it's not in the interest of companies to take risks. And moving outside the messianic fantasies of chromed-up hackers might be what's needed. This wouldn't be a death of Cyberpunk in my mind, but, a resurrection of it. Consistently across all genres, I find the more compelling and interesting and worthwhile media in the small. AAA games have consistently failed, made missteps, or simply have no interest in the themes they claim to explore outside of a surface-level examination. It's not just CDPR, do you remember this shit? And Cyberpunk's themes, as Foster said, matter now more than ever. We live in a world where Alexa listens to us, where multinational companies will change and arrange what we see, where robots are threatening to replace us and the rich are so immensely wealthy that they're fantasizing about space so they can leave us behind on a rotting, dying, overheating world. Cyberpunk won't fix the world, but it's a place to vent frustrations, to suggest alternatives, and above all, perhaps, showcase the humanity that remains. I don't want a Matrix 4 or new Blade Runner, an adaptation of Neuromancer, or 15th Terminator movie or anything like that. Cyberpunk was original because it showed upheaval, change, and shifting worlds, and we're not going to get that by remaking and rebooting and asking what would William Gibson do. It has to change and evolve. I'm not here to prescribe that change, but there are some games I've seen in the last few months that seriously intrigue me. I want to talk about them and what connects them to end off this video. Umurangi Generation is an absolutely wonderful photography sim taking place in a world where Aotearoa has been occupied and walled off by the United Nations to protect it during an alien invasion. It is steeped in anger at government incompetence, and the developer specifically cited his anger at COVID-19 and Australia's bushfires as inspirations. And very much so informed by the developer's Maori background, it's a deeply intimate, quiet story despite the alien invasion, told through photography and small details. It's a story about detritus and afterthoughts in the face of apocalypse. Cloudpunk is another game, one about a delivery driver who works for a not entirely legal delivery service. While I do have my gripes with the story, I think its vibes are off the charts. It's a game where you feel largely powerless, buffeted by the winds of capital and the social mundane violence of everyday life, going from job to job, not sure what choice you'll make or if they even matter. Another YouTuber, Curio, did a whole video about it, and they went into it far better than I ever could. And finally, there's Valhalla, a bar simulator. As a warning, one character in it does lean hard into, lolly aesthetics, and it's a big tarnish on an otherwise interesting game. It presents a world where you're just there, a bartender with relationships to characters dictated by what you serve them, being spoken to constantly, getting a sense for the world that's big just outside your vision. Maybe like overhearing a conversation or seeing some local big shot at a bar and just seeing a glimpse of a world much bigger than yours. What unites these games isn't genre compliance, they're not the vanguard of new cyberpunk. Umurangi Generation shares little in terms with traditional cyberpunk, though genetic modification and massive robots are present, and the developer has expressed frustration with mainstream cyberpunk's ability to contend with the modern world. But what they are, in my mind, are works by people who express ideas, tensions, conflicts, and worries in our modern society in science fiction, with a focus on low lives and a relatively high-tech world. They have a unique vision and ideas to present at the very least, and I found them compelling. They put a hand on your shoulder and say, "Yeah, I know it's shitty." That's a message I think that would gel very poorly with Cyberpunk in the vein of 2077, because it's a AAA game meant to be a looter-shooter. It's not there to comment on the state of the world or speak to an understanding of how shit the world is. It's there to be escapism, a role it serves adequately. The unfortunate truth about Cyberpunk made by corporations is that it is, in fact, Cyberpunk. There's no definition of Cyberpunk that excludes 2077, neatly carves out everything I dislike. It's a genre that's by its nature is fluid, nebulous, and not entirely certain. However, cyberpunk done by corporations will never leave the paradigm a corporation wants. It will never be meaningfully critical of the human cost of the corporation's existence. Johnny Silverhand's shallow critique of capitalism is more silly than it is badass. And what was I expecting? It could never be anything more. Cyberpunk can do better, can be better, and its slow cybernetic revival is something we're seeing all the time in more independent forms of media. These works often focus on the explicitly downtrodden, on the less heroic figures. Instead of chromed up anti-heroes who exist to be cool, instead of people who are magical with their abilities on a computer, what we see instead are delivery drivers, couriers, and bartenders. Some might help, others might just exist in the world, floating from point to point. There's something that resonates deeply in these games, an honest, earnest, human element in their stories and their characters. Something I have a lot of trouble finding in the chromatic aberration of Night City. There's a humanity in being lost to such complex systems, an ennui to modern life that these games capture, and all of them feel more meaningful for it. While these games are far from the only way cyberpunk can evolve and change, and they are far from the only directions I think it'll take, these games show the problems of living in the modern world, the listlessness you feel when nothing seems to matter. They show the humanity and the remains of humanity that exist as the world grows colder and more inhuman. In short, they showcase what humanity remains in a world that is fantastic in premise and technology, but somehow still grounded in regular life and experience. And I would much rather embrace what humanity remains than go and blow up a skyscraper in a misguided revenge plot. Thank you for watching. And since the replacement of capitalism with a democratic communalist model isn't happening anytime soon, here's my Patreon plug. Thank you to my $10 patron, Patrick, and my $5 patrons, Rita Audrey Jones and Alicia Escobar. If you want your names on the credit, consider signing up to my Patreon. If you like the video, like, comment, subscribe. I have no idea if saying this helps, but it's what the cool kids do, I guess.
In 2077, what makes someone a criminal? Getting caught.